Witam Państwa po krótkiej przerwie. Przed nami kolejne
Welcome.
dwa wykłady.
After a very short break, two more presentations ahead of us. First, to be presented by Teresa Wontor-Cichy, who is a historian here in the memorial. She is mostly interested in Christian spirituality in Auschwitz, the fate of Jehovah's Witnesses, but also the Romani. She will talk about the history of the Zigeunerlager in Auschwitz, the recent research. Hello, and over to you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in today's session. In my presentation that I prepared for you, I would like to present the current research when it comes to the history of the Romani in Auschwitz. I would like to share with you a few documents, less known ones, and as the organizers already mentioned, I would like to tell you about what we know now, because we keep working on the subject matter, and the research is continued by different historians and researchers also from other disciplines, not just historians, which definitely is very good for presenting the complete story. At least 23,000 Romani and Sinti were brought to Auschwitz. Majority of them lost their life there as a result of diseases, hunger, or in the gas chamber. Very few Romani were moved to concentration camp in Auschwitz, even before the family camp was established. They got their camp numbers from the general series and the category of an asocial inmate with black triangle, political one with a red triangle, as well as the so-called professional career criminal with the green triangle. There were photographs during registration, just like was the case of other inmates. Then they were directed to work in different commandos. On this slide, you can see one of the Romani inmates brought in this first period. Franz Buriański was brought to the camp on the 9th of July 1941 from Katowice. He got his number 17,855 and the asocial category, ASO, that was the acronym. So this photography is the first document on him, and the second document is his death certificate. He died in Auschwitz on 22nd March 1942. And the document states the reason for his death, and as the reason was the weakening of the heart muscle in course of pneumonia. In this document, in the death certificate, we also see other data on the person concerned, namely where he lived, what was his closest family. Another inmate that was brought in this first period was Edward Paczkowski, arrested in Myszków during the action of German police aimed at the Romani caravan passing by. He was sent to the camp with the number 66,485, and he got the red triangle. So he was classified as a political inmate. He was a very young inmate. He was just 12. He was never part of the Zigeunerlager of the family camp. He worked in different commandos in Auschwitz until he was moved to Buchenwald. He survived the war, and we had the honor to have him here in our memorial museum as a guest. He met our guides and he talked about his fate and his Romani family. Also, Romani from Czechia and Moravia were brought to KL Auschwitz. For instance, Daniel Bernhardt was sent to KL Auschwitz from Prague, where he was registered in KL Auschwitz on 17th June 1942, and he was registered as a Berufsverbrecher, the career professional criminal, labeled also as C for Czechia. After 2 months, Daniel Bernhardt died on the 1st of August 1942. Also, in his case, we have this photography, so we know what he looked like, and the document confirming his death in the camp. Romani inmates were directed to different work related to the extension of concentration lager, just like other inmates. They had to transport construction material, they had to dig trenches, they had to destroy houses that were supposed to be demolished. They had to denivellate the terrain. They were treated the same as other inmates. Starting from March 1942, also women were brought to KL Auschwitz. The first group was located in KL Auschwitz, and then some of them were moved to Birkenau. Anna Kreutz, for example, she was brought to the camp on 17th September 1943, which is the time when the Zigeunerlager, the family camp, was already established in Birkenau, but she was registered as an asocial, and also the number she got, 41,263, is also the number from this general series for women. So we can see that there has been quite a lot of chaos and discrepancies in decisions and classification, talking about the institutions that would send the Romani to concentration camps. This is why some of the Romani were sent to different places, different areas than the Zigeunerlager. The Romani inmates were forced to work just like other inmates. Usually, women also worked on the extension of the camp. We have very rudimentary documentation of the camp and very chaotic documentation and administration, as a result of which it's difficult to say how many Romani men and women were registered in this general series. In 1942, in December, Heinrich Himmler ordered the deportation of the remaining Romani to the concentration camp. And the bylaw to this order was issued on the 29th January 1943. In this bylaw, it was specified that the place of deportation is supposed to be KL Auschwitz. The document that you can see on its second page shows the name Auschwitz. Hence, we can see that it has been specified where the Romani still remaining in different areas of Third Reich or occupied by Third Reich, where they should be sent. When we read the calendar events of KL Auschwitz, we know that on 26th of February, so less than a month later, based on this bylaw specifically, first Romani from Germany were brought to KL Auschwitz. They were sent to this family camp, B2 in Birkenau, in a place that was not finished, but called Zigeunerlager. By the end of 1943, more than 18,000 women, men, and children were sent there. And these were the nationalities of these persons.
Danych zachowanych wiemy, że pochodzili z różnych
Using the
krajów.
data we have, we know that they were coming from different countries, and there were more than 13,000 from Germany, from the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, over 4,000, more than 1,000 from Poland. About 1,000 did not state their nationality. From France, over 100 people. Similarly, the Netherlands, Belgium, former Yugoslavia, 77 people, Hungary, 34 people, Croatia, 48, and from the Soviet Union, 27 people. Also, there were Romani who were citizens of Norway and Spain. As they were treated as asocial inmates, they received black triangles, numbers from a series issued only for that series, with Z for Zigeuner, gypsy. Numbers were tattooed on the left forearm. We can see photographs taken after the war, numbers tattooed on Alojzy Bystricki and Anastasia Burjanska. When they arrived in the camp, they were not undergoing any selections, and families were not separated. Everyone was taken to the barracks where they could wear civilian clothing and they could keep their personal effects and belongings. The photographs taken at registration show inmates in the Z series. They are Johan Holomek, who was transported on the 8th of March, 43, Antonina Donga, who was transported in January 43, so even earlier, but she had not been registered until much later with the letter from the Z series.
O nieustalonych
And
personaliach.
we see here an unknown person who arrived in October 43, and she too was counted into the category Z, although we see that the photograph is characteristic of the inmates who were registered in the women's camp. So there are many inconsistencies between the ways of entering those people into the records. The estimates say that around 23,000 Roma were transported to the camp. About 21,000 were registered, including 378 children who were born in the camp. There were also cases when the Roma were not registered in the camp, but were sent directly to the gas chamber. That happened without a group of around 1,700 Roma and Sinti who were transported to Auschwitz in March 1943 from Białystok for the fear of a typhoid pandemic, as cases of it were discovered among those brought in that transport. The whole group were taken directly to the gas chamber by the authorities. Several days later, another group of the Roma from Białystok were recorded, but because the threat of the typhoid fever was still there, in May 43, the camp authorities ordered selecting around 1,000 Roma, mostly those who arrived earlier from Białystok, and also ones who came from Austria, and they were all murdered in the gas chambers. Of the number of 23 Roma mentioned earlier, 21,000 were killed in the camp, most of them for the illnesses, hunger, and catastrophic conditions. The remaining ones were murdered in the gas chambers. What was the Zigeunerlager like? In the camp's documentation, it's also known as Camp B2E. It was in the central part of Birkenau. We can see from here the so-called Gate of Death to Birkenau, the main gate. From this point, the gypsy camp, the gypsy section, was on the right-hand side. We can see it marked in red here. It was a long rectangle, 600 by 120 meters. It was next to the men's camp, B2D, and hospital for the inmates, the men's hospital. It was also adjacent to the railway lamp, which had not been completed until May 1944. The entrance to the camp, however, was from D3. So looking at this picture from the right-hand side, it was surrounded by barbed wire on concrete poles, and all the wires were electrified. Once again, this is a shot showing where the gypsy section was, and we can see that part of the camp. There were 23 wooden barracks of the stable type. This is a contemporary photograph, we could say. Those barracks were taken down, dismantled, so the visitors today can only see the locations of those. They are marked, and also some of the chimneys. The chimneys you see here in the photograph are chimneys that heated up those barracks. That's where the heat came from. The looks of barrack, here you are, that's a photograph that shows it. And in the Romani section, there were 23 barracks of that type. They had no windows, only at the top there were those narrow lights. The ground was just clay. With time, in some of them, a layer of concrete was on it, or broken bricks were used. Inside, on both sides, were bunk beds in 3 layers. 1 or 2 families, depending on the number of members, would use one such section, such a multi-layered bunk bed. By the door on the right and left-hand side, there were rooms for the functionaries, and in the center there was this solid chimney with 2 stoves. They didn't receive any wood, so it was hardly ever used. The thin walls did not protect against cold, and rain got inside into the barrack through leaky roofs. Apart from the barracks that were used for residential purposes, another photograph showing the bunk beds. Apart from the residential ones, B2E also had several other units. We can see them on a sketch made by Tadeusz Joachimowski, former inmate. By the gate, entrance gate, there were 2 camps' kitchen. In barrack number 3, there was a storeroom for clothes, and number 2, the main chancellery, the rolls, the employment office, and a canteen where for some time they could buy mineral water mattoni, also tooth powder, and other products which were hardly useful in the camp life. Between the barracks 11 and 13, there were places to wash, and between 12 and 14, on the other side, that is, there were the toilets. Behind the barrack 32, there was the so-called sauna, the baths, and the toilets. Now, the 2 places for washing were situated behind the barrack 31. Well, the sanitary rooms were marked by Tadeusz Joachimowski. However, generally, the conditions in all those barracks were hopeless. I mean, sanitary conditions. just because water was provided in too small volumes and wastewater had no place to leave. The latrines were only hardly ever cleaned, and the feces would penetrate the floor. There was also the guard room behind it, where the Rapportführer and the political officer would keep their guard together with the SS guard. The historical photographs let us see the camp. These are the photographs taken for the needs of Bauleitung, that is the construction work crew. And at the back, we can see the barracks of the Roma camp. Also, we can see some of those in the picture, in the drawings made by the inmates. Francis Reich, a Jewish inmate from France, drew that after the liberation. He illustrated his memories of the gypsy family camp. What were the conditions of life in that camp? The day in the camp began from a roll call. During the roll call, the inmates were counted, so you had to come for the head count, even if you were elderly or sick. Also, the bodies of those inmates who died by night were taken there. The functionaries would report to an SS officer who informed the Rapportführer, and after the roll call, the inmates were allowed to return to the barracks. Because in the first period, this section was still being built, some men were employed to finish the construction works on it, and some on various ordering works. Later, most of them did not have a permanent assignment to the work crews. For that reason, the food rations were much smaller, much reduced. Practically, this was only bread, 1/4 spoon of marmalade, 1/4 of a liter of tea, and 1/4 of a liter of camp soup. In the first weeks in the camp, they had some food that they brought with themselves, but even those victuals would come to an end one day. That resulted in a hunger that was unheard of even in the camp, and that caused high death rates. Himmler wanted to camouflage that. Therefore, in April 43, he informed that there would be different food rations for pregnant women and children, milk diet for feeding mothers, breastfeeding mothers, bread, cheese, and also butter. Those who had problems because of hunger, like, for example, diarrhea, they were supposed to receive custard and other products. Most of that, however, was stolen by the functionary inmates, and it never reached the Romani people. Soon, the authorities ceased to apply that instruction. Many of the inmates here had musical talents. Before the war, they were part of migrant groups. As they could retain their instruments, they formed informal bands, and their performances in the camp were a form of integration of the people staying in Zigeunerlager and a particular flight from the reality of the camp they lived in. They were also a particular attraction for the SS staff, as the camp was often visited by various guests arriving there, visiting the Lagerführer, who were the SS staff who were sent to that camp. The first head was Bruno Pfützer, who only held that position for 2 months. He was followed by Franz Hoffmann, who held that function from March to June 43, then Gerhard Palic from June to August the same year. He was followed by Ludwig Plage, August 43, then Friedrich Harder from August 44 to January of the following year. Then came Jakob Jochum from January to spring 44, Reinhold Hartwecker, spring of 44, Hermann Buch, spring to April of the same year, and the last was Georg Bonnegut from April to July 44. The head of the political department for the Romani, which was in Barrack 4, was Perry Broad. There was also for some time Gerhard Lachmann working. The camp's physician for nearly the whole period of the camp was none other but Josef Mengele. In the winter of 43-44, he had a replacement in the person of Franz Lukas, and for a short time there was also Hans König in his place. The liquidation of the Roma camp was managed by Fritz Bantrock, who was the last Rapportführer in the camp. Due to insufficient food, with the overcrowding of that camp, the hygienic and sanitary conditions were dramatically deteriorating, which resulted in frequent breakouts of pandemics and high death rate among the Roma. An example for that is a document that is very curious to read, hardly ever published in the context of the Romani history in Auschwitz, issued in April 43 as the poor quality of water in Zigeunerlager causes that this high death rate is noticed among children under 10. Well, independent of the hospital section in the camp, the family camp for the Roma had a separate hospital, and that was the result of this catastrophic health condition. 6 barracks were separated from the rest with barbed wire. The interiors of the hospital barracks were just like all the other ones. There was clay on the floor, and patients were placed on bunks, 3 layers of straw mattresses, and they were covered with dirty blankets. At entry to the hospital, they gave away their clothes, and they either received shirts or were lying naked. Toilets were just buckets in the corner, and they filled up very quickly. For some time, the problem of Zigeunerlager was the lack of running water, which even further deteriorated the health conditions and caused more pandemics. The most frequent illnesses in the camp were typhoid fever, and also tuberculosis, illnesses of the gastrointestinal tract, and illnesses of the bladder, conditions of the of throat, and malaria, scabby. In another document that also concerned the Romani camp, issued in November 43, we read that 3 female inmates from the camp were sent to blood tests because they were believed to have typhoid, to have contracted typhoid. We can see their numbers, full names, and even the barracks they lived in. We can see that they stayed in the Zigeunerlager in Auschwitz, and that document was signed by the main doctor, Josef Mengele. So the signature on the right is that of Mengele. To the order of the main physician, Dr. Mengele. They introduced radical fight against scabby. First, they were washing people with soapy water, then some base, and finally acid. The effect was just to the contrary, because the wounds were aggravating and the Roma were escaping that form of disinfection. In the summer of 43, a rare illness known as the cancer of the cheek occurred. Its effect were losses in the soft cells of the cheek,
as a result of which the jawbone was exposed. Roma and Sinti was caused by malnourishment, lack of vitamins, and all of the infections. That was a disease mostly of children and the youth. The people with Roma and Sinti were taken care of by other inmates, by the doctors that were inmates, Poles and Jews, and auxiliary personnel. Despite a lot of efforts and care of the inmate doctors, the mortality of Romani was huge. The hospital pharmacy was only equipped in a very, very basic equipment, absolutely insufficient. The Romani were also the victims of medical experiments of Józef Mengele. The function of the head physician of the Zigeunerlager was vested on Mengele from end of May 1943 to August 1944. Here we can see one of the last photos taken before him moving to Auschwitz, and a very important document. This is an official document where we can see a date, 30th of May 1943. This is a date when Józef Mengele was supposed to start working in Auschwitz. Of course, that was related to him coming to Auschwitz, and then the following weeks he took his time to start working there. This is a very interesting document and a very important one, because depending on the literature, depending on the publications, and depending on debates, the question of the presence of Józef Mengele is presented in very different contexts. Sometimes chronology is left out. Some people do not take into account the time in which he really was present in the camp. Everything that is related to Józef Mengele without taking into account chronology is wrong. He became present end of May, but in fact he started working early June 1943 in Auschwitz. There were a few breaks due to his work, due to accident. This is why he was replaced by Dr. Feniger, Dr. Lucas, and other SS physicians, especially in Romani part of the camp, that they were all caused by his absence. Józef Mengele, based on the order of the Institute for Anthropological Research and Biological and Race Research by the William Institute in Berlin-Dahlem. So, as ordered by this institute, he started anthropological research on different race groups, mostly Romani, and on twins. Part of the bath, the sauna, situated behind Block 32, was transformed into his lab, where he was, for instance, experimenting with blood transfusion between the twins. He would infect the children with typhus in order to see whether they are reacting in the same way or differently. However, some of his experiments had no medical substantiation justification. For instance, connecting veins and other parts of the body of two boys, just like Siamese twins. And the last element of the experiment was killing of the twins and the careful analysis, comparative analysis of different organs during the autopsy. And the inmate, who was also a pathologist, Miklos Niszli, was doing this. The selected children and and other persons, usually with physical anomalies, were kept in block 31, called kindergarten, where the children were taken care of by physicians, women physicians. These children were well nourished, they were clean. Dr. Mengele personally visited the twins frequently. He was very kind to them. He would give them sweets and toys. The kids would trust him. They would run to see him, calling him Uncle Mengele, Uncle Mengele. When Noma Facie became president in the Zigeunerlager, Mengele started research on its reasons and how to treat it. This is why in one of the rooms of block 22, two inmates were placed, namely pediatrics professor Bertolt Epstein, whom you can see here on the photograph. That was the liberation photograph. And a dermatologist, also an inmate, Dr. Rudolf Weisskopf-Wittek, who were performing whatever Mengele told them to do. Another thing that was of interest to Mengele were different biological curiosities, like different colors of the eyes in one person, called heterochromia iridis. A lot of Romani inmates with heterochromia were killed in the camp at Mengele's order. The samples obtained this way were stored in the sauna and then preserved, were sent to be researched in the Anthropology and Biological and Racial Research Institute in Berlin-Dahlem or to the SS Medical Academy in Graz. Besides descriptions, Mengele was also trying to accumulate photographic documentation and different artwork. At his order, a Jewish inmate, Nina Gottliebova, was preparing the portraits of Romani inmates, usually the mixed breed, so-called gypsies. Josef Mengele was the head chief physician of the Zigeunerlager until the moment the Zigeunerlager was shut down. Then he became the KL physician, Lagerarzt, responsible for the whole sectors of Birkenau. And before the shutting down of the camp, he left Auschwitz and left Europe, hiding and evading responsibility for what he did. There was a lot of children in Zigeunerlager. It is estimated that there was 11,000 children, including 378 children who were born in Zigeunerlager. All of the children that were born, they lost their lives. Majority died soon after they were born, and the other were murdered when the Zigeunerlager was shut down. And here on this drawing, you can see a young Romani woman, noticed by Mieczysław Kościelniak. Theoretically, the situation of children could seem a bit better. They were not separated from their parents. Based on the instruction of Himmler's office of April 1943, children and pregnant women were supposed to get some better food, which was the fact for a short time. However, in the situation of epidemic outbreaks, for instance, typhus, by the end of spring 1943, then mortality among children was huge. Sometimes 100 persons would die in the camp, out of which 60 were children. Other children were also sick with other diseases, including erysipelas. The administration of the camp consciously did not counteract the catastrophic situation of the Romani camp, which was consistent with the secret order of Himmler to treat sick Romani in a discreet way, especially children. So sick children were placed in a hospital, and they could only count on the care of the inmates that would work there. In the Zigeunerlager, the kindergarten was ordered by Dr. Mengele. It was a type of a kindergarten and preschool nursery with children up to the age of 6, including the ones that Mengele was interested in. The barracks that were supposed to become the kindergarten were painted white with some colorful paintings, with a playground for children, sandbox, seesaws, and other options to work. The children that were playing were taking care of other inmates, nurses. Sometimes they were photographed and filmed by higher SS officers, as well as civilians who were visiting the camp. And for propaganda purposes, children were given sweets in front of cameras. 39 children were also 39 children from Mulfingen orphanage were also sent to B2E. Before the deportation, the children were subject to different tests and exams that were run by Dr. Robert Witt and Eva Justin. And their main aim was to confirm the endogenic character of Romani, who, despite different attempts of being raised out of Romani society, they were supposedly not able to get rid of their tendencies to steal, to be migrant, and incapable to assimilate. Let's have a look at them.
Dobrze. Dzieci te zostały odebrane
Okay.
rodzicom.
So these children were taken away from their parents. They were placed in the orphanage where nuns would take care of them. Then they were taken from the orphanage, and only a small group, just a few of them, survived because they were deported before the Zigeunerlager was shut down. Elsa Schmidt was among the ones who were transported to the camp. She was born in 1935. She was adopted as an infant by a German family from Hamburg. Her biological mother was qualified by the German administration as a Romani. This is why in 1943, she was supposed to be arrested. However, her parents managed to avoid it, and she was released from the camp. Here we can see Elsa with her sisters. However, later in 1944, she was arrested again and was sent with a group of Romani to Birkenau. She was 8 years old back then. She survived thanks to the care of another Romani inmate, Wanda Fischer. Thanks to the efforts of her adopted parents, she was moved to Ravensbrück, and then in September 1944, she was released from that camp. In 2020, during the celebrations commemorating the liberation of Gail Auschwitz. Zabeka was our honorary guest, and we can see her on the photography, and we had the honor of listening to her testimony.
As I have mentioned, many of the SS staff were in the Zigeunerlager. They had different duties there, and many of them arrived with their guests and visitors, like Rudolf Höss, the commander. In the memories he wrote about that event, the following picture, Rudolf Höss is here on the right. The photograph was taken in Zollahütte, the place where they rested, and next to Commander Höss, there is Josef Mengele. Next to him on the left, Richard Baer, the third and the last commander of Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss wrote his memories in prison. They are an analysis that's absolutely soulless and doesn't portray his personal involvement in the story of the Roma. That was probably his purpose, because he was awaiting the trial. Let's read. Despite the hard conditions, majority of the gypsies, as I could realize, did not suffer much psychologically due to imprisonment, unless you paralyzed their drive for traveling. They were used to poor hygienic conditions, tight spaces, and also insufficient food in their previous primitive life. They did not die in large numbers. In fact, they stayed children. They were ready to play, also at work, which they did not treat seriously. Even in the worst moments, they were trying to find good sides and to remain optimist. I never noticed any somber and hateful looks from the gypsies. If you passed next to the camp, they would come out immediately from their barracks and played instruments. They made children dance. They showed their usual tricks. There was a small square there where the children could play to their heart's delight with toys. When you addressed them, they spoke out and they shared honestly their wishes. I believed they were not fully aware that they were imprisoned. End of quote. Of similar character are the memoirs of the head of the political division, Perry Broad. Even though his responsibility was far lesser, he also did not say what happened there. The Roma who were in Auschwitz, who were imprisoned in Auschwitz, also tried to escape, being constantly in the fear of their lives and future. In May 1943, three, most probably family, Anton Daniel, Victor Daniel, and Ludwig Daniel, fled from the camp. Ludwig and Victor were caught and taken to the cellars of Block 11 and later executed by the firing squad in May 43. The fate of the third remains unknown. The document you can see here is a cable sent with the information about the flight of the three. The SS staff had the permit to shoot at all the inmates who would move away. The order of Rudolf Hess of the 7th May 43, we can read about praise for an SS guard, Alexander Forschutz, who on the 4th of May 43 made it impossible for two Romani inmates to flee. Names of those who had received a prize, 3 days leave. It is also one of the very rare documents, and it is very interesting as it illustrates the life in the Romani camp? Well, a relatively large number of the Roma were taken to the penal work crew, and they were there in various periods of time. While the camp was in operation as a family camp, the authorities began to move the Roma to camps in the Reich and employing them mostly in industry. In April 44, a group of over 800 men were taken to Buchenwald. On the same day, more than 500 women were taken to Ravensbrück. Flossenbürka, in May 44, also a group was taken, nearly 100 inmates. The last transport was sent on the 2nd of August, just before the liquidation, to Buchenwald. A handful of the Roma were released from Auschwitz on the condition of sterilization. Moreover, there were individual cases of releasing the Roma or taking them to camps, former soldiers of the army, those with military medals coming from mixed marriages. Usually, these were results of the interventions of the non-Romani members of their family. The Zigeunerlager camp closed on the 2nd August 44. In the evening of that day, around 4,300 men and women and children remaining in the camp were loaded into lorries and taken to the gas chamber. The Romani and Sinti wanted to resist, but the SS crew brutally quenched it. The correction of the number that remains known results from the work of historians from the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. An insightful analysis of documents, accounts, made it possible to come closer to the facts, to take a look at the end of the operation of the Roma camp, and deciding that the number was greater than we had known. The details will be available in the latest issue of Zeszyty Oświęcimskie Journal, our bulletin, and that article is going to be published there. After the liquidation of the Roma camp, there were still Roma and Sinti in the camp. The report from 21st of August 44, we can find in the mother camp, that's Auschwitz, 9 Roma. In Monowitz, 25, altogether 34 people of Roma and Sinti origin. In another document from Monowitz, we can see there were 2 Roma or Sinti there. So we must admit that even after the liquidation of the family camp, there were still some of them in very small numbers on the premises of Auschwitz. This is information that we have. Where do we have our knowledge? A range of documents. The most precious are the rolls, so-called Hautbooks, the main books, which scrupulously include scrupulous records of all the people who were detained in the camp, men separately, women separately. There are numbers, professions, place of birth, date of birth, and there's history in the camp. In July 44, they were wrapped in men's clothing, placed in a bucket by Polish inmates who held certain tasks there. They were Tadeusz Joachimowski, who was the scribe, and Ireneusz Pietrzyk and Henryk Porębski. The bucket was recaptured in 49. The books were very wet. You can see what they looked like. And to a degree, they were damaged. Hence, there were some difficulties in obtaining information about the personal data of the first inmates. Now in Block 13, there is a permanent exhibition on Porajmos, the murder of the Roma. All the interested parties are welcome to draw from a podcast in which I tell the story of Sinti and Roma in Auschwitz, and to our e-learning lesson, Roma in Auschwitz. Thank you very much, Teresa, for presenting to us the issue of the Zigeunerlager and various aspects of its operation. As we've heard, not all the Roma and Sinti in Auschwitz were in Zigeunerlager. It existed for 17 months, and as you said, it was liquidated on the night of the 3rd August 44. Then more than 4,000 people were taken to gas chambers, and as you emphasized, this is the new number, greater than the one that was quoted for years. About the story of the Roma, you can read in our online e-learning lesson, and in the podcast, you can find them on the museum's website, and we encourage you to participate. Once again, thank you very much.